Hello, friends, here we are again with fresh economic news flowing in from the heart of New York City, the financial capital of the world. Let's dive deep into the latest policy maneuver announced by Mayor Eric Adams, where the city plans to terminate a controversial program that has been providing prepaid debit cards to migrant families housed in city-funded hotels. This decision has raised several eyebrows and drawn heated debate from both sides of the aisle, highlighting why economic policies, particularly during times of widespread hardship, require careful thought and planning. But today, we're not just scratching the surface. You'll want to sit down for this one because we're about to peel back the layers on how such government mismanagement directly reflects deeper economic issues and policy failings that could soon have broader repercussions across the country. Stick with me, we're going from point to surface here, with data charts, facts, and real-world examples to illustrate just how misaligned the city has become with the financial realities of its residents. First off, let's break this issue down clearly. The program provided migrants, in this case, around 2,600 families, with prepaid debit cards, with loading to the total tune of roughly $3.2 million in taxpayer money. These prepaid cards were primarily dished out to help cover basic necessities like food. For a family of 4 with young children, about $350 per week was allocated through these debit cards. That's right, $350 a week. Let's just pause and think about this. It sounds humane on paper. After all, no one wants to see families go starving, whether they're migrants or long-time residents. However, the direct economic question surfaces when we examine this in detail: is this really a sustainable, long-term solution to deal with the migrant crisis? Let's put migrant policy aside for a second and zero in on some cold, hard facts. New York City has long been a place that is notorious for skyrocketing living costs. Rent is through the roof, and inflation has eaten into the pocketbooks of even the city's middle-income families. Families scraping by week to week, paycheck to paycheck, are finding it difficult, if not excruciatingly painful, to keep up with the spiking costs of groceries, gas, utilities, and, of course, housing. Consider this: according to the latest 2024 Consumer Price Index, CPI, report released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, food prices in the U.S. Northeast have surged 6% year-over-year. In New York City, basic grocery items like bread, eggs, and vegetables have risen by even more, with some categories of food witnessing near double-digit price hikes in the last 12 months. Rent? You would not believe this if I didn't have the data right in front of me, but rent prices in prime areas across Manhattan and Brooklyn have officially averaged over $4,500 a month. Imagine how the average American, who's not living off government subsidies or assistance, mind you, can cope when a basic necessity like housing eats up nearly half of their income. And now, producing $3.2 million in prepaid debit cards for migrants. This alone has raised concerns from citizens and critics across the political spectrum, looking at how the city's priorities need calibration. Hundreds of thousands of New York residents have been grappling with rent hikes, near-zero wage growth amid rising inflation, stagnant job creation overall, and of course, the stifling cost of basic services. In such a scenario, when the city chooses to pump millions of dollars into a new migrant relief program without adjusting for its direct impact on existing residents, it's political and economic mismanagement, plain and simple. Now, it's important to delve further into how this situation places existing taxpayers at a structural disadvantage. The average household income in New York City is just under $70,000 per year, with a significant portion of that eaten up by housing, utilities, and basic expenses, groceries, education, transportation, etc. Yet, while the city has resources allocated to assist both struggling local families and this massive influx of migrants, it's absurd how often funds have been diverted questionably. Take this very program, which, instead of integrating migrants into a system that provides opportunities for employment, training, or self-sustainability in the future, gives out cash handouts. Folks, cash handouts do not fix systemic problems. Ever. It's like putting a band-aid over a bullet wound and calling it good while refusing to deal with the underlying damage. As we can see with this policy wind down, these programs are unsustainable, and once the city inevitably steps back, the very people you were helping are left in the lurch. Did the city suddenly get an infinite credit card to pay for these one-time relief programs? No. What happens now when these families have become reliant on this aid, but the aid runs dry because politicians planned poorly from the start? But there's something even more deeply rooted here, something I want everyone to reflect on. This pattern is reflective of broader fiscal irresponsibility, similar to the economic handouts we've seen implemented in various cities across the U.S. over the past few years. From welfare programs with ill-defined objectives to social programs run on taxpayer dollars without a sustainability plan, are we really surprised that inflation is skyrocketing? These programs fail for one simple reason: they fail to promote jobs, incentivize productivity, or facilitate a growth engine needed to offset costs. What's the lasting impact? Look no further than basic productivity numbers as measured by economic indicators. In New York specifically, labor force participation rates have stagnated below pre-pandemic levels, sitting at approximately 62.9% as of Q3 2024. When the working population itself declines, government-aided programs like the prepaid debit cards mentioned earlier aren't just an expense, they're a counterproductive drain on the economy. How does this work exactly? Simple: if you continue provisions/dependency mechanisms without simultaneously generating forward economic multiplier effects, you end up depleting your monetary base. Money supplied into this non-productive system circulates negatively in the long term, driving up inflation and reducing purchasing power. This isn't rocket science, it's the simple, fundamental failure of public policy understanding basic economic impacts. More spending without underlying output means higher inflation and reduced economic welfare for all. Mayor Eric Adams' statement, "It was an emergency, and now we're moving in another direction," does little to quell concerns or justify the bad economics at play here. Was it purely an emergency? Or was it instead poor foresight into longer-term fiscal responsibility? If there's anything our viewers should take away from this fiasco, it's this: long-term sustainability must be at the core of any policy. Handouts do not cultivate an economy, they allow for temporary survival but enable long-term stagnation. New York's approach to this migrant crisis, well-intentioned, perhaps, but incomprehensibly misguided, paints a troublesome picture moving forward. That said, it would be unwise to look only at the fiscal irresponsibility isolated here and fail to address disparities in decision-making across the country that will, eventually, compound into much larger problems. The hints are already showing up at the national level. Look at federal debts, explode to unprecedented levels, exceeding well over $33 trillion as of Q4 2024. A decade of budgetary mismanagement, quantitative easing, and emergency spending, which they claimed was to help circumvent fiscal emergencies, has now landed us in a place where federal interest rates are crippling government operations. Another critical topic to touch on as we scale this analysis outward: how can the government then justify additional spending on social programs like these amid crumbling infrastructure, housing crises, inequality, etc.? Clearly, prioritization is neither clear nor happening, and unless Washington, Albany, and yes, NYC itself begin recalibrating how their financial help gets distributed, it won't stop at NYC migrants losing programmatic debit cards. Trust me on this. We also can't ignore the political elephant in the room. While this announcement was happening, Mayor Adams simultaneously spoke about collaboration with the incoming administration under President-elect Donald Trump to resolve some of the city's funding issues. Whether you laughed or cried reading that statement, just understand that navigating federal-local collaboration is fraught with more layers of inefficiencies and protracted bureaucracy. Do we really expect some magic influx of federal funds under the new administration to solve all the woes of NYC's financial headaches? Historical data says not likely, unfortunately. Suffice it to say that the timing looks more like a "we'll see" situation, but the track record of such outsider collaboration leaves plenty to be skeptical about. Perhaps the most shocking takeaway here: even though the emergency programs are coming to an end, the migrant crisis and housing crunch at large are just a sliver of the broader skullduggery of economic despair the country's policymakers are dealing with. Unless drastic measures are taken to incentivize migration akin to employment generation, foster real GDP spirals, and correct long-standing fiscal imbalances, buckle up. At the end of the day, folks, this comes back to productivity and value distribution. And it's disappointing to see that through the migrant crisis, mismanagement rather than economic growth wisdom has triumphed. Alright, I've rambled on long enough today. Do me a favor, subscribe, hit that notification bell, we've got a lot more deeper dives coming through as this plays out. Any thoughts, throw them down in the comments below. Let's keep this ball rolling.